There's a person in your life you can feel before they even speak. Maybe you know exactly who I mean. Maybe it's the person who can walk into a room and, within minutes, the entire emotional temperature changes. Nobody says it out loud. Nobody points at it directly. But everyone feels it. The laughter gets tighter. The air gets heavier. People start measuring their words. Someone pours another drink. Someone suddenly becomes very interested in clearing the plates. Someone else goes quiet. And if you've ever spent time around a person like this, then you know the strangest part is not always what they do. It's what they do to you. Because long after the dinner ends, long after the meeting is over, long after the family gathering breaks up and everybody drives home, they are somehow still there. In your body. In your thoughts. In that one sentence you keep replaying. In the weird guilt you can't explain. In the exhaustion that feels bigger than the moment should justify. That's the part no one prepares you for. No one prepares you for the kind of person who can drain the life out of an ordinary afternoon without ever raising their voice above a socially acceptable level. No one prepares you for the person who turns every conversation into a slow, invisible tug-of-war where you walk away feeling confused, off balance, and vaguely ashamed, even though you cannot point to one single dramatic thing that happened. And that is exactly why these people are so hard to name. Because if someone screamed in your face, everyone would recognize the damage. If someone openly insulted you, everyone would understand why you were upset. If someone smashed a glass, slammed a door, or made a scene in public, there would be evidence. But what do you call the person who needs every moment to orbit them? What do you call the person who can't stand not being the center of gravity? What do you call the person who doesn't seem interested in your life, your feelings, your joy, your pain, unless somehow it can be redirected back to them? What do you call the person who erupts when they lose control, or sulks when they lose attention, or quietly poisons the atmosphere until everybody bends themselves around their mood? Maybe you've been calling them difficult. Maybe you've been calling them insecure. Maybe you've been telling yourself they're just intense, just wounded, just under pressure, just having a hard time. But deep down, you know this is something else. Because every time you are around them, the same thing happens. You prepare. You prepare your tone. You prepare your face. You prepare your answers. You prepare your exits. You prepare little emotional sandbags before the storm even arrives. And that is not normal. That is not what love feels like. That is not what safety feels like. That is not what healthy connection feels like. Let me make this real. A woman named Claire is getting ready for a weekend event in Charleston with her husband. On paper, it sounds lovely. A beautiful city. A family function. Nice clothes. Good food. Old friends. The kind of weekend people post smiling photos about. But Claire isn't excited. She's bracing. Because there's one person who's going to be there. She doesn't want to name them. Not because she's dramatic. Not because she's trying to stir up gossip. But because saying their name out loud already feels like giving them more power than they deserve. She already knows how it's going to go. If the attention isn't on them, they'll find a way to pull it back. If the plans don't go their way, they'll make everybody pay for it. If someone else gets praised, they'll interrupt, undercut, or find a reason to darken the mood. If nobody feeds their ego, they'll retreat into that sulking silence that somehow makes the entire room feel guilty. And if they need something from you, suddenly they know exactly how to sound warm, charming, almost tender. That's what makes it so disorienting. It's never all bad. If it were all bad, you would have left already. If it were all obvious, you wouldn't still be doubting yourself. If it were all cruelty, the story would be much simpler. But it's not. It's a smile followed by a sting. A compliment with a hook hidden inside it. A warm moment that turns cold without warning. A conversation that starts normal and somehow ends with you defending your own reality. That's why so many people stay stuck for years around this kind of personality. Because they keep waiting for clarity. One undeniable moment. One final proof. One clean answer. Instead, what they get is something much more destabilizing, 1,000 small moments that leave them feeling crazy. And maybe that's why this hits such a nerve. Because I'm not just talking about one person at one party in Charleston. I'm talking about your boss. Your mother. Your ex. Your sister's boyfriend. Your father. Your coworker. Your friend who only calls when they need something. The person who can somehow make your best day feel smaller and your worst day feel invisible. You know who this is. And if you know who this is, then you also know this truth: the hardest part is not being around them. The hardest part is what happens to you afterward. You leave feeling drained, but you tell yourself you're overreacting. You leave feeling irritated, but you talk yourself out of it. You leave feeling sad, embarrassed, angry, and strangely hollow, and then you spend hours trying to explain away your own pain. Maybe they didn't mean it like that. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I should have worded that differently. Maybe I should have stayed calmer. Maybe if I were stronger, this wouldn't get to me so much. Listen to me carefully. That inner spiral is not random. It is often the first sign that you are dealing with someone who has learned how to keep other people emotionally off-center while staying perfectly centered themselves. And once you see that, really see it, something shifts. Because now the question is no longer, how do I get them to understand me? Now the question becomes, how do I stop losing myself in this? That is the question that changes lives. Not how do I win? Not how do I expose them? Not how do I finally say the one magical sentence that makes them feel remorse? But how do I protect my peace without getting dragged into another exhausting argument? That's what this conversation is really about. Because so many good people have been taught the wrong survival strategy. They've been told to explain more. Be calmer. Be kinder. Be clearer. Try harder. Communicate better. Stay patient. Give grace. Take the high road. And for healthy relationships, those things matter. But around certain people, all that extra honesty doesn't bring you closer. It just gives them more material. More access. More insight into what hurts you. More opportunities to twist the conversation until you are the one apologizing for a wound they created. That's the trap. And if you've been caught in that trap, I need you to hear something today that may hit you right in the chest. You are not weak because this person affects you. You are not dramatic because you leave interactions with them feeling shattered. You are not broken because your body knows something your mind is still trying to explain away. Sometimes your exhaustion is not an overreaction. Sometimes it is evidence. Evidence that you have been standing too close to someone who feeds on attention, control, admiration, and emotional chaos. Evidence that the reason you feel so tired is because some part of you has been doing invisible labor for years just to survive their presence. Evidence that what you call a hard personality may actually be a pattern that is hurting you more than you've wanted to admit. And if that's true, then this may be one of the most important conversations you ever hear. Because by the end of this, you may finally understand why arguing never works, why setting boundaries the usual way can backfire, and what actually protects you when you're dealing with someone who always has to make it about them. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and support this community. It genuinely helps us keep making thoughtful, honest videos like this, videos that don't just name painful patterns, but help you understand them, survive them, and come back to yourself stronger than before. And now I want to ask you something simple, because I think your answer will say a lot. When you think about the most exhausting person in your life, what happens more often? A. They explode, argue, dominate, and make every conflict loud and obvious. B. They drain you in quieter ways, through guilt, sulking, manipulation, and making everything revolve around them. Comment A or B below. Narcissism is not just a big ego. What makes someone dangerous is not always how loudly they love themselves. That is one of the first mistakes people make when trying to understand narcissism. They look for the obvious signs. The bragging. The arrogance. The grand entrance. The self-obsession that practically announces itself the second a person walks into the room. And yes, sometimes narcissism does look like that. Sometimes it does wear expensive confidence, a polished smile, and a constant need to be admired. But very often, the real damage begins somewhere much quieter. Claire did not need a textbook to know that something was wrong with the person waiting for her in Charleston. She did not sit there thinking, this person has a big ego. That would have been too simple. Too harmless. Too easy to brush off. What she felt was more disturbing than that. She felt erased. That is the word many people cannot find at first. They say drained, confused, annoyed, exhausted, tense. All of that is true. But underneath those feelings is often something deeper and harder to admit. When you are around a narcissistic person long enough, you begin to feel that your inner world is slowly being pushed out of the room. Your joy becomes inconvenient unless it reflects well on them. Your pain becomes irritating unless they can use it to look caring. Your success becomes a threat. Your boundaries become disrespect. Your independent thoughts become disloyalty. Your needs become too much. And that is why narcissism is not just a big ego. A big ego can be irritating. It can be embarrassing. It can make someone insufferable at dinner. But a big ego alone does not always hollow out the people nearby. A person can be flashy, vain, overly confident, and still have a heart that functions. They may talk too much about themselves, but when it really matters, they can still show up. They can still care when you are hurting. They can still apologize when they cross a line. They can still make room for a reality that is not their own. That is the difference. The true issue is not self-importance by itself. The true issue is what happens when another person's humanity collides with it. Because narcissism, in the way people experience it in real life, is not just a person thinking highly of themselves. It is a whole way of moving through relationships. A way of treating other people less like separate human beings and more like extensions, mirrors, tools, witnesses, or obstacles. Other people exist, but not always as fully real. They exist in terms of function. Who admires me? Who agrees with me? Who serves me? Who reflects well on me? Who gives me attention? Who threatens my control? That is why being close to a narcissistic person can feel so lonely, even when they are constantly talking to you. You may be deeply involved in their life, their moods, their needs, their crises, their disappointments, their stories, their image, their plans. But somehow, they are never truly with you in yours. They may know the details of your life, but not because they cherish your interior world. They know what they need to know to manage the relationship on their terms. That is a very different thing than love. Claire had spent years trying to explain this to herself in softer language. She told herself the person in Charleston was needy, sensitive, competitive, a little emotionally immature. Maybe insecure underneath it all. Maybe secretly wounded. Maybe more fragile than anyone realized. And that may all have been true. But truth becomes dangerous when it is incomplete. Because people who care deeply often use empathy to protect themselves from clarity. They see the wound in the other person and miss the pattern. They focus on what might have happened to that person and lose sight of what keeps happening to them. They become so committed to understanding the pain behind the behavior that they stop measuring the cost of the behavior itself. That is how a lot of good people stay trapped. They do not stay because they are foolish. They stay because they are hopeful. They stay because they are thoughtful. They stay because they do not want to be cruel. They stay because they keep believing that if someone is hurting underneath, then love, patience, and understanding should eventually reach them. But narcissism does not become less harmful just because pain lives underneath it. That is one of the most sobering truths a person can learn. A narcissistic person may absolutely be insecure. They may need admiration because they cannot soothe themselves. They may seek control because uncertainty terrifies them. They may dominate because shame lives just under the surface. They may react with arrogance because their inner life is more fragile than it appears. But if the result is that everyone around them feels smaller, less safe, less visible, and less free, then the emotional explanation does not cancel the emotional damage. This matters because many people are still waiting for a clean stereotype. They imagine that a narcissistic person should be easy to spot. Obviously boastful. Obviously vain. Obviously cruel. Obviously impossible. But that is not how it always works. Some narcissistic people are charming. Some are funny. Some are magnetic. Some are generous in public. Some seem deeply attentive in the beginning. Some know exactly how to make you feel special when they want access to you. Some are polished enough that other people call them brilliant, charismatic, even inspiring. And this is where the confusion gets worse. Because if someone is awful all the time, most people can protect themselves. But if someone is wonderful in flashes, many people start building their emotional life around those flashes. They wait for the warmth to come back. They chase the version of the person that appears when things are going their way. They become students of mood, trying to predict when the kindness will vanish and when it might return. They start adjusting themselves, trimming themselves, managing themselves, hoping that if they get it exactly right, they can keep the good version alive. That is not a relationship built on mutuality. That is emotional weather survival. And Claire, though she would not have used those exact words yet, had already been living inside that truth. She did not fear the person in Charleston because they were always loud. She feared them because they were unpredictable in a very specific way. They could be warm when admired, cold when overlooked, attentive when they needed something, dismissive when someone else had a moment. It was not randomness. It was pattern. That is another reason narcissism is not just a big ego. It is not merely excessive self-love. In many cases, it is a fragile, hungry, demanding emotional structure that needs constant regulation from the outside. Attention regulates it. Praise regulates it. Control regulates it. Winning regulates it. Being right regulates it. Being central regulates it. And when that regulation is threatened, relationships often pay the price. You see it when the conversation shifts to someone else's success and suddenly the narcissistic person has to interrupt, minimize, or redirect. You see it when feedback, even gentle feedback, is treated like betrayal. You see it when somebody else's pain becomes an inconvenience because it interrupts the emotional hierarchy. You see it when they can offer empathy in theory, but not when empathy requires them to stop centering themselves. This is why the word harmful matters so much. Not dramatic. Harmful. Not flashy. Harmful. Not annoying. Harmful. A person with a big ego may leave you rolling your eyes. A narcissistic person can leave you questioning your memory, your tone, your needs, your standards, and even your right to take up emotional space. That distinction changes everything. Because once you understand it, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, are they confident or insecure? Are they arrogant or wounded? Are they selfish or just stressed? Those questions may be interesting, but they do not always protect you. A better question is this: what happens to me in the presence of this person over time? Do I feel more free or more careful? More seen or more erased? More grounded or more confused? More alive or more depleted? More able to be myself or more trained to manage their reactions? That question gets you closer to the truth. And it also helps you step away from the trap of needing a formal label before you trust your experience. Claire did not need to diagnose the person in Charleston to acknowledge that something deeply unhealthy happened every time the room bent around them. She did not need a clinical term to know that the emotional math never added up. She did not need permission to notice that one person's hunger for attention was quietly costing everyone else their ease. Sometimes naming the exact disorder matters in clinical settings. But in life, what often matters first is recognizing the pattern. Recognizing that this is not just vanity. Not just confidence. Not just insecurity. Not just a strong personality. Not just a difficult phase. It is a relational style that often leaves other people carrying confusion they did not create. And once you see that, another painful but freeing truth begins to emerge. You may have spent years trying to respond to this person as if they were simply emotionally clumsy, when in reality the problem runs much deeper than poor communication. That realization can hurt. It can also save you. Because the moment you understand that narcissism is not just a big ego, you stop waiting for small adjustments to fix a deeply distorted dynamic. You stop assuming that a little more patience, a little more generosity, or a slightly better explanation will solve something structural. You begin to understand that what you are dealing with is not just self-centeredness. It is a way of relating that can quietly consume everyone near it. And if that is the truth, then the goal is no longer to decode every contradiction in them. The goal is to learn how to stop disappearing inside it. The trap: why arguing never works. The trap is not that Claire does not know something is wrong. The trap is that every time she tries to deal with it like a reasonable person, she ends up feeling less reasonable by the end. That is how this kind of dynamic works. At first, you think the problem is the issue itself. A rude comment. A sudden mood shift. A cutting remark at dinner. A conversation hijacked and turned into a performance. You think, if I can just address this clearly, directly, calmly, maybe we can move forward. Maybe I can stop this pattern before it gets bigger. Maybe the tension is coming from misunderstanding, and misunderstanding can be fixed. That belief is deeply human. It is also exactly what keeps so many people stuck in arguments they were never meant to win. Because when you are healthy, you tend to assume that other people are at least partly interested in truth. You assume that if you speak honestly enough, the truth will matter. You assume that if you stay calm enough, the other person will eventually calm down too. You assume that if you explain the impact of their behavior, something inside them will shift. Maybe not instantly. Maybe not perfectly. But enough. That assumption makes sense in healthy relationships. It fails in narcissistic ones. Claire learned this slowly, and then all at once. She used to think the answer was timing. If she brought something up at the right moment, maybe the person in Charleston would hear it differently. If she didn't mention it in front of other people, maybe they wouldn't feel embarrassed. If she used softer words, maybe they wouldn't get defensive. If she was patient, measured, generous, and fair, maybe she could create the kind of conversation that two adults are supposed to be able to have. But every path led to the same place. If she brought something up gently, they accused her of being too sensitive. If she brought it up directly, they accused her of being aggressive. If she waited for the perfect time, they said she was dredging up the past. If she spoke in the moment, they said she was ruining everything. If she stayed calm, they kept pushing until she was no longer calm. And the second she showed emotion, the entire conversation became about her reaction instead of what had happened. That is the trap. You walk into the conversation believing the subject is the problem. They walk into the conversation believing the subject is control. That difference changes everything. Because once control becomes the hidden goal, the argument is no longer about resolution. It is about positioning. About who gets to define reality. About whose feelings count. About who gets to be offended. About who gets to leave the conversation looking stable, superior, innocent, or wounded. And if you do not understand that, you will keep showing up with honesty to a fight that is being run on a completely different currency. This is why arguing with a narcissistic person feels so uniquely maddening. It is not just that they disagree with you. Healthy people disagree all the time. The deeper problem is that the argument does not stay attached to truth. It slides. It bends. It shifts shape in real time. You think you are talking about what happened at dinner. Suddenly you are defending your tone. Then you are defending your memory. Then you are defending your motives. Then somehow you are apologizing for bringing it up at all. The issue never stays the issue. That is not an accident. It is one of the most destabilizing features of the whole dynamic. When someone cannot tolerate accountability, the conversation must be moved. If they cannot face what they did without feeling diminished, exposed, or threatened, then the focus has to be redirected somewhere safer for them. Your wording. Your timing. Your facial expression. Your past mistake. Your energy. Your supposed disrespect. Your failure to appreciate everything else they do. Anything but the original wound. And because you are trying to be fair, you follow them there. That is where so much emotional damage happens. You think you are being open-minded. You think, well, maybe my tone could have been better. Maybe I did come in too strong. Maybe I should own my part too. And while self-reflection is a beautiful quality, in this kind of dynamic it can become a weapon turned inward. Your willingness to examine yourself becomes the very thing that keeps the argument alive. Meanwhile, the other person rarely enters the same level of reflection. They are not asking, "What did I do here?" They are asking, "How do I get out of being the one at fault?" The tragedy is that people like Claire are often exceptionally good at self-examination. They replay everything. They edit themselves in hindsight. They analyze each phrase, each pause, each facial expression. They work so hard to be responsible in conflict that they end up carrying responsibility for conflicts they did not create. That is why arguing never works the way you hope it will. Not because you are weak. Not because you are bad at communication. Not because you have failed to find the magic sentence. It fails because you are trying to use mutual dialogue in a situation where mutuality is not the governing principle. And the body knows this before the mind fully admits it. That is why some conversations leave you shaking afterward. Why your chest feels tight. Why you cannot focus for hours. Why you replay every word in the car, in the shower, in bed at 2 in the morning. Why part of you feels ashamed even when another part knows you were right. Your nervous system is responding to instability. You are not just having a disagreement. You are being pulled into a space where the rules keep changing. Where sincerity does not necessarily create safety. Where vulnerability can become leverage. Where facts are filtered through ego. Where your attempt to resolve tension is met with maneuvers designed to preserve dominance. Anyone would feel disoriented inside that. And yet many people still believe the answer is to argue better. They believe they need more evidence. A calmer voice. A stronger spine. A more airtight explanation. One final conversation where they finally say everything exactly right. But that fantasy is often what keeps them trapped. Because the real pull of the argument is not just the argument itself. It is hope. Hope that this time the person will understand. Hope that this time your pain will finally matter. Hope that this time truth will land. Hope that this time they will reveal some hidden fairness that makes all the previous confusion worth it. Hope is what keeps people coming back for one more round. And in healthy love, hope is often beautiful. In a narcissistic dynamic, hope can become the hook. Every now and then the person gives you just enough to keep the dream alive. A soft moment. A thoughtful message. A brief apology. A charming version of themselves that almost convinces you the worst part is over. And because you are wired for connection, you think maybe now the real conversation can happen. Then you try again. And once again, the floor disappears beneath you. This cycle is one reason people begin to lose trust in themselves. They do not just feel hurt by the other person. They feel betrayed by their own repeated belief that the next conversation will be different. Over time, that creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Not just emotional exhaustion, but cognitive exhaustion. The exhaustion of trying to make a coherent map out of a relationship where the landmarks keep moving. Claire had spent years thinking the solution was to keep entering the conversation more skillfully. What she had not yet fully accepted was that the conversation itself was often the mechanism of control. The loop was the point. The confusion was the point. Her over-explaining was not leading out of the maze. It was keeping her inside it. That realization is painful, because it forces you to let go of a comforting illusion, that every hard relationship can be healed through effort and insight. Some can. This kind usually cannot, at least not in the way you want. And that does not mean words are always useless. Sometimes you do need to say something. Sometimes a brief, grounded response matters. Sometimes clarity is necessary for legal, practical, or moral reasons. But clarity is different from arguing. One is about stating reality. The other is about getting pulled into a spiraling contest where your energy gets drained and nothing actually changes. That distinction matters. A short truth may serve you. A long fight usually will not. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited into. You do not have to defend your every feeling to someone committed to misunderstanding it. You do not have to keep presenting evidence to a person whose loyalty is to self-protection, not truth. You do not have to prove that your pain is real by arguing until you collapse. In fact, one of the most radical things a person like Claire can learn is this: sometimes the argument feels urgent only because the other person has trained your nervous system to believe that peace must be negotiated in real time. But real peace does not come from finally winning the fight. It comes from stepping outside the structure that keeps recreating it. That is why arguing never works. Not because your voice lacks power, but because the arena itself is rigged. You think you are trying to reach understanding. They are often trying to avoid vulnerability, preserve control, and keep reality arranged in a way that protects their image. Once you see that, something begins to loosen. You stop measuring success by whether they finally admit what they did. You stop mistaking circular conflict for emotional intimacy. You stop believing that one more explanation will rescue you from a pattern that feeds on explanations. You begin to understand that the more precious thing to protect is not the argument. It is your clarity. And clarity, unlike the argument, can actually set you free. The real shift: stop trying to change them. The real shift does not begin when Claire finally says the perfect thing. It begins when she stops believing that the perfect thing exists. That is the moment most people resist the longest, because it feels like surrender when it first arrives. It feels like loss. It feels like grief. It feels like standing in the middle of your own life and realizing that the person you kept trying to reach was never standing in the same place with you. You were speaking toward a version of them that existed mostly in hope. And hope can keep a person alive for a very long time. It can also keep them trapped. For years, Claire told herself the same story in 100 different ways. Maybe the person in Charleston would soften if she chose her words more carefully. Maybe they would listen if she brought things up privately instead of in the moment. Maybe they would respond differently if they did not feel cornered. Maybe they needed patience. Maybe they needed gentleness. Maybe they needed understanding. Maybe beneath all the self-absorption, all the emotional control, all the strange ways every room seemed to bend around them, there was a hidden person who could still meet her with honesty and care. That story cost her more than she understood at the time. Because when you keep trying to change someone, you end up arranging your entire inner life around possibility. You stop responding to what is. You start investing in what could be. Every interaction becomes a test. Every soft moment becomes evidence. Every apology becomes a breakthrough. Every brief stretch of peace becomes a sign that maybe, finally, the relationship is turning a corner. And then it turns right back into what it has always been. That cycle is brutal, not only because it hurts, but because it slowly teaches you to distrust the clearest thing you know, the pattern. The pattern has been telling the truth for a long time. But hope has a way of making people treat patterns like accidents. So they explain them away. They minimize them. They turn them into exceptions. They tell themselves this outburst came from stress. That cruelty came from insecurity. That coldness came from exhaustion. That manipulation came from fear. That selfishness came from pain. And maybe some of that is true. Maybe all of it is true. But the trouble begins when understanding the cause becomes a reason to ignore the cost. This is why the real shift is so important. The real shift is not learning more about them. It is becoming more honest with yourself. It is the moment when Claire stops asking, "How do I get them to become the person I keep hoping is in there?" and starts asking, "What has this pattern actually done to me?" That question changes everything. Because the answer is usually not abstract. It is painfully specific. It has made her rehearse before ordinary events. It has made her second-guess her own memory. It has made her over-explain simple decisions. It has made her feel selfish for having needs. It has made her think of peace as something fragile, temporary, and dependent on somebody else's mood. It has made her confuse being emotionally prepared with being emotionally free. And once she begins to see that clearly, another truth rises with it: she has not just been trying to love this person. She has been trying to manage them into becoming someone safer. That is an exhausting way to live. There is a special kind of heartbreak in realizing that your devotion has quietly turned into emotional labor. That your patience has turned into strategy. That your compassion has become surveillance. That your hope has made you hypervigilant. You are no longer simply in a relationship with the person. You are in a relationship with their potential, their volatility, their patterns, their moods, their reactions, their blind spots, and your own endless attempt to navigate all of it without setting anything off. At some point, a person has to ask whether this is love or whether it is survival dressed up in more noble language. That is where radical acceptance enters, and it enters with far more tenderness than people expect. Acceptance sounds harsh to people who are not ready for it. It sounds like giving up. It sounds like cynicism. It sounds cold. But true acceptance is not cold at all. It is one of the warmest things you can offer yourself, because it stops asking your heart to bleed for a fantasy. Acceptance says this person is who they have repeatedly shown themselves to be with me. Not who they are on their best day. Not who they are in public. Not who they become when they need something. Not who they briefly resemble after a scare, a loss, a confrontation, or a stretch of distance. But who they consistently are when they are disappointed, challenged, ignored, corrected, or not at the center. That is the version that matters. And that can be a devastating realization, because it means Claire has to grieve more than behavior. She has to grieve possibility. She has to grieve the future she kept trying to earn. The ease she thought might arrive if she stayed steady enough. The mutual understanding she kept imagining was just one more conversation away. The person she thought she was loving may have existed only in fragments, glimpses, and projections. This is why people cling so hard to the wish that change is possible. Because if they stop clinging, they have to feel the full weight of what has been true for a very long time. They have to admit that all those careful conversations did not transform the relationship. That all that extra empathy did not teach reciprocity. That all that overthinking did not produce safety. That all that self-editing did not produce peace. And yet, as painful as that is, there is also something almost holy in the moment a person stops bargaining with reality. Because reality, however painful, is much easier to live with than illusion. Illusion keeps you split in half. One part of you sees exactly what is happening. The other part keeps begging it to mean something else. That split creates enormous suffering. It is exhausting to know and not want to know at the same time. To feel the danger and still explain it away. To recognize the pattern and still keep waiting for an exception that can save the story. Claire is not weak because it took her time to get here. People do not release hope quickly when hope is tied to love, family, belonging, history, or identity. They hold on because something deep inside them believes that persistence is virtue. That staying emotionally available proves goodness. That being the last one to give up means they loved more truly. But staying attached to fantasy is not the same as loving well. Sometimes it is simply what pain looks like when it has not yet become clarity. When the shift finally happens, it is not dramatic from the outside. Nobody hears a loud crack. No orchestra swells. No one hands Claire a certificate announcing that she has awakened. The shift is quiet. It happens when she stops entering each encounter with fresh innocence. It happens when she stops confusing temporary warmth with transformation. It happens when she no longer lets a single nice moment erase the meaning of 100 painful ones. That is not bitterness. That is memory becoming honest. An honest memory is one of the strongest forms of self-protection. Because once Claire truly accepts the pattern, she no longer has to spend so much energy being surprised by it. She stops calling each new incident shocking when it is actually familiar. She stops treating every disappointment like new information. She stops taking every selfish act as a personal referendum on her worth. She stops asking, "Why are they doing this again?" and begins to understand that the deeper question is, "Why have I kept expecting a different result from the same emotional structure?" That question gives her power back. Not because it changes them, but because it changes where she places her hope. Before, her hope was invested in their awakening. Now, her hope begins to move toward her own clarity. That is a profound shift. Because clarity asks much less of the world and gives much more back to the self. It does not wait for confession. It does not demand perfect closure. It does not need the other person to finally tell the truth before you are allowed to act on what you have lived. It says, "I have seen enough. I know enough. I do not need one more collapse, one more twisted conversation, one more charming reset to prove what the pattern has already revealed." And that is where strategy becomes possible. Not before acceptance. After it. Without acceptance, strategy feels mean. It feels like overreacting. It feels like giving up too soon. It feels like you are being unfair to someone who is trying. But after acceptance, strategy feels sane. Necessary. Clean. It no longer comes from revenge or superiority. It comes from reality. From the simple understanding that you cannot keep offering your most vulnerable parts to someone who has shown you, repeatedly, that they do not know how to hold them with care. What makes this shift so difficult is that it asks people to separate love from access. Claire may still care. She may still feel compassion. She may still understand that the person in Charleston is likely driven by deep insecurity, fragility, or emotional hunger they cannot manage well. None of that has to disappear. What disappears is the illusion that caring more will cure the pattern. That illusion is often the final thing to go. And when it goes, people sometimes fear they are becoming hard. They worry that acceptance will make them cynical, detached, or unkind. But what usually happens is something far better. They become softer in the right places. They stop pouring all their energy into an unwinnable emotional project. They start saving that tenderness for their own body, their own future, their own healing, their own healthy relationships. They become less entangled and more alive. That is the gift hidden inside acceptance. Not that it spares you grief. It does not. But it makes the grief clean. It allows you to mourn what is real instead of bleeding endlessly for what never fully was. It allows you to say, with sadness but also with dignity, "This person may never become what I kept waiting for. And I do not have to destroy myself proving how long I was willing to hope." That sentence can change a life. Because from there, Claire no longer has to spend every interaction trying to produce an emotional miracle. She can stop performing unpaid labor for a relationship that keeps charging her more than it gives. She can step out of the exhausting role of translator, fixer, stabilizer, and believer. She can become something simpler and stronger. She can become honest. And honesty, in the end, is what opens the door to peace. Boundaries that actually work, the inside job. The hardest lesson Claire learned was that boundaries are not always something you say. Sometimes they are something you quietly build inside yourself after you finally accept that the person in front of you is not going to honor your peace just because you explain it beautifully. That realization can feel deeply unfair at first. It can even feel humiliating. Because most of us were taught that healthy adults solve problems by talking about them. You say what hurts. You ask for respect. You tell the truth clearly. You name the behavior. You give the other person a chance to respond. That is how mature relationships are supposed to work. And with emotionally healthy people, it often does. But Claire was not walking into Charleston to spend a weekend with an emotionally healthy person. She was walking into a dynamic where clarity had too often become ammunition. The more precisely she named what hurt, the more precisely that hurt could be touched again. The more sincerely she explained her limits, the more those limits seemed to become a challenge instead of a guide. The more openly she tried to create a respectful understanding, the more she found herself standing in the aftermath of another strange emotional collision, wondering how a simple request had somehow become a fresh source of conflict. That is why this part matters so much. Because once you understand that some people do not hear boundaries as information but as resistance, your whole strategy has to change. A lot of people imagine boundaries as a moment of brave confrontation. A sentence delivered with a steady voice and a lifted chin. Something clean and satisfying. A declaration that says, "This is what I will and will not tolerate." And there is absolutely a place for that kind of sentence in life. But when you are dealing with someone who experiences your autonomy as a threat, a spoken boundary can become the beginning of a new game. Now they have something to push against. Something to mock. Something to test. Something to punish. That is why the most powerful boundaries in narcissistic dynamics are often not performances. They are structures. They are the private decisions Claire makes before the weekend even begins. She decides how long she is staying. She decides what subjects are no longer open for discussion. She decides what time she will leave. She decides how much explaining she is no longer willing to do. She decides what version of herself will not be coming into the room this time, not the over-explainer, not the peacekeeper at any cost, not the woman who mistakes access for closeness. And that is what makes internal boundaries so powerful. They do not depend on the other person's agreement. They depend on your own follow-through. That is a completely different kind of strength. Because spoken boundaries can sometimes be a request in disguise. You tell someone your limit while secretly hoping they will care enough to honor it. You say, "Please don't talk to me that way," and beneath the sentence is a deeper prayer: "Please show me that my feelings matter to you. Please prove that I can be safe here. Please respond like someone who sees me." There is nothing weak about that longing. It is a profoundly human longing. But in the wrong relationship, it can keep breaking your heart. Claire had lived that heartbreak more than once. She had tried the polite version, the calm version, the direct version, the compassionate version. She had tried to frame things gently. She had tried to give context. She had tried to stay measured enough that nobody could accuse her of being unfair. And still, her attempts to create understanding often dissolved into the same old pattern. Defensiveness. Denial. Moodiness. Retaliation. A strange emotional shift where she somehow ended up carrying the burden of having named the problem. That is why internal boundaries are not passive. They are what remain when illusion is gone. An internal boundary sounds less dramatic, but it is often much more life-changing. It says, I am not discussing this topic with them anymore. It says, I am not staying in that house all weekend. It says, I am taking my own car. It says, I am sitting near the exit. It says, I am not answering late-night messages just because they create urgency. It says, I will not explain my no 5 different ways in hopes of making it easier for them to swallow. It says, I already know how this conversation goes, and I am no longer required to step into it just because I was invited. That last one is enormous. Because one of the most damaging habits people develop around narcissistic personalities is the habit of overparticipation. They feel responsible for every emotional disturbance. Responsible for smoothing the tension, clarifying the misunderstanding, proving their intentions, cleaning up the mood, rescuing the evening, de-escalating the reaction, explaining themselves into innocence. They become managers of emotional weather that was never theirs to control. Internal boundaries end that job description. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But decisively. Claire began to understand this when she realized that many of her old, boundary conversations were really attempts to negotiate with reality. She was still acting as though the right words could produce a different character. As though enough sincerity could create mutuality. As though if she remained calm and fair long enough, the person in Charleston would eventually meet her there. But boundaries that work are not built on fantasy. They are built on pattern recognition. You stop asking what should work in an ideal world and start asking what actually protects you in the world you are in. That is a sobering shift, but it is also a deeply freeing one. Because suddenly your energy is no longer being poured into changing them. It is being invested in stabilizing yourself. That may look small from the outside. It may simply mean Claire books a hotel instead of staying in the family home. It may mean she leaves after dinner instead of staying for drinks, where the atmosphere always turns sharp. It may mean she politely declines topics she knows will be used to provoke. It may mean she refuses to rescue the mood when someone starts sulking for attention. It may mean she allows silence to exist without scrambling to fill it. It may mean she answers one manipulative text with one neutral sentence instead of 6 paragraphs of explanation. These things may not look dramatic, but they are dramatic where it counts. They change the architecture of the dynamic. And perhaps the most important part is this: internal boundaries protect your nervous system before they protect your image. That matters because so many people stay overexposed to harmful dynamics because they are afraid of how boundaries will make them look. Rude. Cold. Difficult. Distant. Ungrateful. Unforgiving. They are willing to suffer privately in order to remain publicly likable. But there comes a moment when that bargain becomes too expensive. Claire was beginning to reach that point. She was beginning to see that every time she abandoned her own limits in order to appear easygoing, she paid for it later. In exhaustion. In resentment. In self-betrayal. In that terrible hollow feeling that comes when you know you were there for the whole interaction, but not fully there for yourself. Internal boundaries heal that fracture. They teach you that you do not have to announce every act of self-protection to make it real. You do not have to justify every limit to someone committed to misunderstanding it. You do not have to turn every decision into a seminar on why you deserve basic peace. Sometimes dignity is quiet. Sometimes dignity is leaving on time without a speech. Sometimes dignity is changing the subject without apology. Sometimes dignity is not picking up the call. Sometimes dignity is letting someone be displeased without rushing to make their displeasure disappear. That last part is especially hard for people who have been trained by narcissistic dynamics. They often carry an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's emotions. If someone is offended, they feel they must fix it. If someone is cold, they must warm the room. If someone is angry, they must soothe it. If someone is disappointed, they must make a case for why they are still good. Internal boundaries break that trance. They remind you that another person's reaction is not always a moral verdict on your behavior. Sometimes it is simply what happens when a controlling person does not get the access, attention, or obedience they expected. That distinction can give a person their life back. And still, it is important to be honest, internal boundaries are not painless. They may make the other person more irritated. They may accuse you of changing. They may call you selfish, distant, dramatic, or mean. They may notice that the old version of you is becoming less available and try to pull harder. This is where many people panic and go back. Not because the new boundary was wrong, but because the other person's discomfort feels unbearable. But discomfort is not always danger. Sometimes it is simply evidence that the pattern is no longer flowing as easily as it used to. Claire had to learn that too. She had to learn that just because someone reacted badly to a limit did not mean the limit was wrong. Sometimes a poor reaction is exactly what reveals why the limit was needed. That is a painful truth, but a clarifying one. And over time, something beautiful begins to happen when a person practices boundaries in this quieter, deeper way. They stop feeling like a collection of reactions. They begin to feel solid again. Trustworthy to themselves again. Their no becomes cleaner. Their yes becomes more honest. Their body starts to believe that it does not have to stay on high alert all the time. Their mind stops rehearsing quite so much. They recover faster. They explain less. They feel less compelled to chase people down emotionally just to be understood. In other words, they come back to themselves. That is the real purpose of boundaries. Not control. Not punishment. Not superiority. Return. Return to your center. Return to your values. Return to your own internal authority. Return to the truth that your peace is not something other people must first approve before you are allowed to protect it. And once Claire understood that, Charleston began to change in her mind. It was no longer just the place where one difficult person would be waiting. It became the place where she would test a new kind of loyalty. Not loyalty to harmony at any cost. Not loyalty to appearances. Not loyalty to the old role she had outgrown. Loyalty to herself. That is the inside job. And once it begins, nothing in your life stays quite the same. Hard situations, marriage, divorce, parenting, and family ties. The hardest truths rarely live in simple advice. That becomes painfully clear the moment narcissism moves beyond an annoying coworker, a difficult relative, or a person you can quietly avoid at a party in Charleston. It becomes something else entirely when the person is your spouse. Your child's other parent. Your mother. Your father. Your adult son or daughter. The person tied to your finances, your home, your court dates, your holidays, your grandchildren, your sense of duty, your history, and the life you thought you were building. This is where so much shallow advice falls apart. Because from the outside, people love clean answers. Leave. Cut them off. Stand up for yourself. Stop tolerating it. Just set boundaries. Just walk away. Just go no contact. But people who have actually lived inside these dynamics know that life is not just anything. When the narcissistic person is woven into your daily reality, your children's reality, your legal reality, or your moral reality, every decision gets heavier. Every option carries a cost. Every choice can feel like an injury, no matter which direction you move. And one of the loneliest parts of this experience is how often the world demands certainty from people who are standing in impossible complexity. Claire understood this more than most people around her realized. From the outside, some assumed the person in Charleston was simply someone she needed to see less often. A difficult family member. An exhausting personality. A problem that could be managed with distance and perspective. But what many people do not understand is that for countless men and women, the deepest pain is not the narcissistic behavior itself. It is the web around it. The marriage. The children. The money. The aging parent. The adult child. The court system. The family system. The impossible question of how to protect yourself without accidentally exposing someone more vulnerable than you. That is where this conversation has to get more honest. Because once children are involved, the emotional equation changes. A woman may know that her husband's rage is harmful. She may know the house gets smaller when he is upset, that everyone starts managing the air around him, that the children listen for footsteps, that dinner can turn tense in seconds. She may know in her bones that something is wrong. But then the questions begin that nobody from the outside has to answer for her. If she leaves, what happens when the children are alone with him? If custody is split, who protects them in the hours she cannot see? If she stays, how much of themselves do the children lose by growing up inside that atmosphere? If she fights in court, does the legal battle become a new weapon in his hands? If she waits, is she protecting the children or teaching them that love means endurance? If she goes now, can she afford it? If she cannot afford it, what then? If he has charm in public and power in private, who will believe her? These are not theoretical questions. They are the questions that keep people awake at night. This is why anyone who talks about narcissistic relationships in simplistic language has not stood close enough to the real fire. Sometimes there is no perfect answer. Sometimes there is only the least devastating next step. And that truth deserves respect. In marriages like these, people often imagine the breaking point will be some giant dramatic event. But many times, the breaking point is quieter. It is the moment a mother sees fear in her child's eyes. It is the moment she realizes she is no longer asking whether the relationship is happy, but whether it is survivable. It is the moment she stops measuring the marriage by love and starts measuring it by damage control. It is the moment she notices that she has become a translator, a shield, an emotional decoy, a buffer between a narcissistic adult and a child who should never have had to learn this much tension this young. That is when strategy stops being optional. Not because strategy is cold, but because love without strategy can leave vulnerable people unprotected. So if someone is living in that reality, the work often becomes painfully practical. Learn the laws where you live. Understand custody. Understand finances. Talk to an attorney early, even if you are not ready to file. Get documents in order. Learn what the system does and does not care about. If a child needs therapy, start as early as possible. If there are patterns, document them. Not dramatically. Not obsessively. Faithfully. Carefully. Because when a narcissistic person realizes they are losing control, the story may change. The image may sharpen. The mask may become more polished, not less. People who have never dealt with this often underestimate how much abuse can continue after separation. They think the divorce is the ending. Very often, it is just a new chapter. When control can no longer be exercised through intimacy, it may be exercised through procedure. Scheduling. Delays. Court dates. Parenting apps. Money. Technicalities. Paperwork. Endless conflict disguised as legitimate disagreement. A child becomes the most sacred concern in the mouth of someone who is actually using the child as a channel for punishment. This is one of the most heartbreaking realities in family life with narcissistic people. Love can become a point of leverage. A person who knows where your soul lies will often reach for exactly that place. And when children are involved, that place is obvious. That does not mean parents should live in fear. It means they should live in truth. It means they must stop expecting decency to restrain someone who sees every attachment as a possible instrument. It means they must build systems, not just hopes. Support, not just faith. Witnesses, records, therapy, legal guidance, financial clarity, emotional steadiness. None of that is paranoia. It is preparation. The pain deepens in a different way when the narcissistic person is not your spouse, but your parent. There is something uniquely disorienting about being the adult child of a narcissistic mother or father, because the wound did not begin with one relationship choice. It began before you had language. Before you had distance. Before you understood that the atmosphere in your home was not the atmosphere in every home. For many people, adulthood becomes the first time they even begin to recognize that what they called loyalty was often fear, what they called closeness was often enmeshment, and what they called respect was often self-erasure. And then life presents a cruel twist: the very parent who shaped so much of your pain may someday need care. Now what? What does compassion look like when history is not clean? What does duty mean when love has been tangled with control for decades? How do you care for an aging parent who never really cared for your emotional world? These are not questions with universal answers. Some people choose distance. Some choose structured care. Some choose limited contact with strict protections. Some choose to show up not because the parent earned it, but because they want to remain aligned with their own values. That distinction matters. You do not always do the right thing because the other person deserves it. Sometimes you do it because you deserve to live with yourself afterward. But even then, the same rule applies: compassion without structure will break you. An aging narcissistic parent may still criticize, demand, guilt, manipulate, and rewrite reality. Illness does not automatically create wisdom. Frailty does not automatically create tenderness. Old age does not necessarily soften a personality that has spent decades feeding on attention and control. So if Claire, or anyone like her, ever finds herself in that role, she will need support, limits, time away, and a very honest relationship with her own expectations. She cannot go looking for gratitude. She cannot make caregiving a secret final audition for the love she never got. That road leads straight back into grief. And then there is another heartbreak people rarely talk about enough: the narcissistic adult child. For many parents, this may be the most confusing pain of all. Because when your own grown son or daughter becomes manipulative, punitive, entitled, or emotionally predatory, the grief is layered with guilt. What did I miss? What did I fail to do? Did I cause this? Could I have prevented it? Was I too soft, too absent, too scared, too late? And if grandchildren enter the picture, the pain becomes almost unbearable. Because now access to the children may become transactional. You want to see them, so you tolerate more. You want to stay connected, so you bend. You tell yourself it is for the grandchildren. And maybe it is. But the emotional cost can be staggering, especially if the adult child realizes exactly how much leverage those children provide. This is where family ties can become the most heartbreaking form of captivity. Not because you are weak, but because love creates openings that control can exploit. So what do people do in these situations? They stop looking for pure answers and start living by deeper principles. They ask, what must be protected first? The child? My sanity? My finances? My legal footing? My physical safety? My long-term ability to remain stable? They ask, what is my true north here? What matters so much that I need to build my decisions around it? For one person, that may be keeping a child in therapy. For another, it may be preserving enough financial independence to leave later. For another, it may be staying emotionally regulated enough to parent well inside a difficult marriage until a safer transition can happen. For another, it may be seeing the grandchildren without handing over every piece of their dignity in the process. For another, it may be caring for a parent while refusing to surrender their whole life to the role. This is the part people do not say enough: strategy is not the opposite of love. In hard family situations, strategy may be the most loving thing available. It is love with eyes open. Love that understands systems. Love that plans. Love that documents. Love that does not confuse blind sacrifice with moral purity. Love that knows a vulnerable child does not need a heroic speech nearly as much as they need a steady adult. That is why the hardest situations require a different kind of courage. Not the courage of one perfect decision that solves everything forever. But the quieter courage of living inside ambiguity without abandoning reality. The courage to make imperfect choices in impossible systems. The courage to protect what can still be protected. The courage to stop asking, what is the clean answer, and start asking, what is the wisest next step for the people who depend on me? For people like Claire, that shift can mean the difference between being swallowed by the complexity and moving through it with a little more steadiness. Not certainty. Not ease. Not a painless ending. But steadiness. And when family life has been shaped by narcissism, steadiness is not a small thing. It is often the beginning of survival. Teenagers, new relationships, and false hope. There is a special kind of fear that lives inside uncertainty. It is not the fear of what you know. It is the fear of what might still become true. That fear shows up in two places more often than people like to admit. It shows up when a parent looks at a difficult teenager and quietly wonders, is this just adolescence, or is this something darker taking shape? And it shows up when someone has finally escaped a narcissistic relationship, only to watch the other person move on quickly and seem, at least from the outside, more loving, more stable, more devoted than they ever were before. These are two very different situations, but they touch the same wound. The wound of false prediction. The wound of not knowing whether what you are seeing is temporary, developmental, performative, or the beginning of a deeper pattern. The wound of standing in front of behavior that frightens you and realizing there is no simple sentence that will make it easy to understand. Claire knew that feeling well. By now, she understood a lot about the person in Charleston. She understood the pull of the room, the emotional distortions, the way self-importance could slowly suffocate truth. But what troubled her more deeply was how easy it had become to start seeing narcissism everywhere once she had learned to recognize it somewhere. That is a very human response. Once you finally have language for a painful pattern, your mind starts scanning the horizon for it. You become more alert, more watchful, sometimes wiser, sometimes more afraid. And fear, if it is not handled carefully, will try to turn uncertainty into certainty too fast. That is why teenagers require so much caution. A teenager can be selfish, moody, dramatic, entitled, dismissive, emotionally explosive, intensely self-focused, and at times almost impossible to live with. Any parent who has survived adolescence knows this. A teenager can slam a door over a request as small as emptying the dishwasher and then turn around and spend 2 hours comforting a friend in crisis. They can act as though your existence is an inconvenience while still carrying tenderness they barely know how to show. They can look alarmingly self-centered and still be doing the normal developmental work of separating, testing, becoming. That does not make it easy. It just makes it more complicated. Because the truth is, adolescence is not a polished stage of life. It is a rough construction zone. Identity is unstable. Emotions are intense. Perspective is still developing. Impulse control is unfinished. Social belonging often feels like survival. Teenagers are not only trying to become themselves, they are also trying to break away from the people who once defined their world. And that process can be ugly. So when a parent sees arrogance or coldness or cruelty at home, panic often rushes in too quickly. They think, this is who my child is becoming. They assume the worst because the behavior feels so personal, so sharp, so relentless up close. But one of the most important truths a parent can remember is this: not every hard teenager becomes a narcissistic adult. You can sometimes understand narcissism by looking backward. You can look at a deeply narcissistic adult and often see signs that something was off long before adulthood. But you cannot always look at a teenager in real time and know for sure what their adult personality will become. Development is far less linear than fear wants it to be. What matters more is range. How does the teenager behave only with you, and how do they behave everywhere else? Are they difficult at home but capable of loyalty, reciprocity, and empathy with friends? Do teachers, coaches, relatives, and other adults experience them as basically decent, even if moody or immature? Can they care for someone else without making it about themselves? Can they feel remorse after causing harm? Can they repair, even imperfectly? Those questions matter because narcissism is not just about emotional intensity. It is about a wider relational pattern. A teenager who is rude at home but kind, mutual, and caring elsewhere may be doing painful but ordinary developmental work. A teenager who is exploitative, contemptuous, manipulative, and devoid of reciprocity across every environment deserves a different level of concern. This is why parents have to resist the seduction of premature labeling. A label can feel like control, like clarity, like finally naming the monster. But in family life, labels can harden fear before understanding has had a chance to breathe. They can turn every behavior into proof and every conflict into prophecy. And once that happens, the relationship itself can begin to suffer under the weight of your panic. That does not mean parents should minimize what they see. It means they should stay grounded in observation instead of jumping straight into identity verdicts. Watch patterns. Watch peer relationships. Watch how your child handles disappointment, accountability, and frustration. Watch whether they can care about anyone else without personal gain. Watch for substance use, safety issues, emotional numbness, risky behavior, chronic dishonesty, or repeated cruelty across contexts. And as much as possible, refuse the useless power struggles. That may be one of the hardest lessons for frightened parents to accept. When you are scared about where a child is heading, every conflict can feel symbolic. The messy room becomes about discipline. The forgotten chore becomes about character. The disrespectful tone becomes about whether your child is turning into someone unrecognizable. And because the fear is so large, the argument becomes larger too. But many parents lose influence by trying to win on the wrong battlefield. If the dishwasher becomes a war, nobody learns anything except how to fight harder. This does not mean no limits. Teenagers need limits. They need accountability. They need adults who notice, who hold structure, who pay attention to what is happening in the full picture. But influence comes more easily through steadiness than domination. If you sense your teenager is drifting into something darker, your best chance often lies in staying observant, protecting safety, refusing constant ego battles, and staying connected to whatever is still alive inside them. Their music. Their drawing. Their gaming. Their running. Their obsession with film, fashion, coding, basketball, photography, anime, or sound design. The thing that still lights them up. Because connection often reaches places that control cannot. Now let's move to a different form of false hope, one that breaks hearts in adulthood. Few things are more destabilizing than surviving a narcissistic relationship and then watching the other person move on as if none of it mattered. Sometimes it happens almost immediately. A new partner appears. The photographs look radiant. The captions sound breathless. The new connection seems softer, happier, more intimate. And the person left behind, still carrying confusion and grief, begins asking the question that has tormented countless people in silence. What if they change for someone else? That question can haunt a person more than the breakup itself. Because it reaches straight into self-worth. It suggests a possibility almost too painful to touch. Maybe they were capable of real love all along. Maybe they were capable of empathy, devotion, tenderness, maturity, and peace. Just not with me. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too emotional, too needy, too wounded, too difficult, too demanding. Maybe the new person is getting the version of them I begged for and never received. That story is emotionally devastating because it takes all of your pain and turns it into evidence against you. But what you are usually seeing is not transformation. It is intensity wearing a new face. That distinction matters more than people realize. Narcissistic people can be incredibly compelling in the early stages of love. In fact, they may seem most alive there. Attraction is electric. Attention is abundant. Certainty arrives fast. Compliments feel intoxicating. Plans for the future sound beautiful. You are not just liked, you are chosen, elevated, idealized. And to someone who has longed to feel deeply seen, it can feel almost sacred. But intensity and health are not the same thing. A relationship can feel cinematic and still be emotionally unsafe. A person can be attentive and still be incapable of reciprocity. A connection can begin with overwhelming passion and still collapse under the first real demand for humility, accountability, patience, or mutual care. That is why phrases like love bombing and future faking matter. They describe the painful gap between what is promised emotionally and what can actually be sustained relationally. Love bombing floods the beginning with attention, admiration, and urgency. Future faking builds castles in the air and hands you the keys before there is a real foundation beneath your feet. Both can feel like proof of love. Neither guarantees depth. And when those patterns collapse, the person left behind often feels not only heartbroken, but replaceable. That feeling is brutal. Because it is one thing to lose a relationship. It is another to feel as though you were just a role in a script that someone else can restage with a new co-star at any moment. Claire had seen enough by now to understand that public romance is often the least reliable evidence of private health. A smiling photo does not reveal reciprocity. A quick engagement does not prove emotional maturity. A dramatic declaration of forever does not mean the person has developed the capacity for lasting, grounded love. Healthy love is not measured by how intensely it begins. It is measured by how truthfully, patiently, and mutually it continues. That is the part people in pain need to remember. The next relationship is not your verdict. Their performance is not your worth. Their speed is not your failure. Their new beginning is not proof that your suffering was imagined. If anything, the speed with which some narcissistic people attach again can reveal how urgently they need fresh validation, fresh admiration, fresh emotional fuel. Moving on quickly is not always a sign of healing. Sometimes it is a sign of hunger. And still, the wounded heart wants certainty. Will they ever change? Was any of it real? Did I matter? Is this teenager in front of me developing into someone dangerous, or just struggling through a painful stage? Is that new relationship the real thing, or just the next illusion? Some of those questions cannot be answered immediately. That is what makes them so hard. But there is wisdom in refusing to let fear make the meaning too fast. With teenagers, stay curious longer than your panic wants to. With new relationships after narcissistic love, stay grounded longer than your insecurity wants to. Do not mistake intensity for depth. Do not mistake possibility for proof. Do not mistake your fear for prophecy. Sometimes what looks frightening is still unfolding. Sometimes what looks beautiful is still a performance. And sometimes the deepest act of self-protection is not rushing to certainty, but learning how to live close to truth without demanding that truth becomes simple. That kind of patience is not weakness. It is discernment. And discernment, more than fear, is what keeps a person free. Your peace, your power, your life. There comes a moment when the entire struggle changes shape. Not because the narcissistic person finally understands you. Not because they suddenly become gentle, accountable, or capable of the kind of love and honesty you kept hoping would appear. Not because the past makes sense. Not because justice arrives in a clean, satisfying form. The shift happens when your life stops revolving around the question of them. That is the real turning point. For a long time, people like Claire believe peace will come after one more conversation, one more insight, one more explanation, one more boundary, one more attempt to finally make the relationship make sense. Even after all the disappointment, some part of the heart still whispers the same old bargain: if I can just understand this well enough, maybe I can stop hurting. If I can respond wisely enough, maybe I can finally be free. But freedom does not come from mastering another person's chaos. Freedom comes from no longer organizing your inner life around it. That is a much deeper kind of healing. Because narcissistic dynamics do not only injure you in the moment. They colonize attention. They move into your mind. They teach you to wake up already anticipating. To enter rooms already calculating. To hear a text notification and feel your body brace before your thoughts catch up. They train you to spend precious life force on prediction, recovery, translation, damage control, and emotional cleanup. Even when the person is not physically present, the pattern can still be running inside you. That is why the final work is not just learning how to deal with them. It is learning how to come back to yourself so fully that they are no longer the center of gravity in your life. Claire had spent so much time trying not to be thrown off that she almost forgot another question existed: what would it feel like to live without constantly preparing for impact? What would it feel like to wake up and not immediately scan the emotional horizon? What would it feel like to make choices based on joy, values, rest, meaning, creativity, and love rather than fear of someone else's reaction? That is not a small question. For many people, it is the beginning of an entirely different life. Because when you have spent years around narcissistic behavior, survival starts to disguise itself as personality. Hypervigilance begins to feel like maturity. Over-explaining feels like kindness. Self-erasure feels like flexibility. Emotional exhaustion feels normal. You stop noticing how much of your life has been shaped around keeping the peace because peace, in your world, was never something stable. It was something temporary, negotiated, fragile, and always at risk of being broken by another person's need for control, admiration, or emotional dominance. So reclaiming your life is not just a motivational slogan. It is a re-education of the soul. It begins with a quieter, more radical idea than most people realize. Your peace is not something you earn by being good enough for difficult people. Your peace is something you protect because it is sacred. That sentence lands differently when a person has lived what Claire has lived. Because for a long time, peace felt conditional. It felt dependent on whether the person in Charleston was in a good mood, whether the room stayed flattering enough, whether nobody challenged the wrong thing, whether no one else received too much attention, whether she said everything carefully enough, whether she kept the emotional weather stable enough. In that kind of world, peace is no longer an internal state. It becomes a hostage situation. And the deepest recovery begins when you stop negotiating for the release of what was always yours to protect. This does not mean becoming hard. It does not mean becoming suspicious of everybody. It does not mean closing your heart and calling it wisdom. In fact, one of the most beautiful parts of real healing is that it often makes people more themselves, not less. Claire does not need to become colder. She does not need to lose her empathy, her tenderness, her emotional intelligence, or her depth. What changes is where those gifts are placed. They stop being poured endlessly into a structure that cannot hold them with care. They begin flowing toward safer places. Toward people who know how to receive. Toward relationships with reciprocity. Toward children. Toward friendships. Toward work that matters. Toward the body that has carried too much for too long. Toward the life waiting underneath all the noise. That is where real power lies. Not in dominating the narcissist. Not in defeating them at their own game. Not in forcing confession, closure, or remorse. Real power is much quieter. It is the power to leave a conversation with your self-respect intact. The power to stop explaining beyond the point of usefulness. The power to let someone be displeased without treating their displeasure as your emergency. The power to trust the pattern more than the occasional performance. The power to make decisions from reality rather than longing. The power to stop calling self-abandonment love. That kind of power does not feel glamorous at first. Sometimes it feels disappointingly ordinary. It looks like not replying right away. It looks like ending the visit when you said you would. It looks like not defending yourself in circles. It looks like keeping records instead of entering debate. It looks like staying in therapy long enough to hear your own voice clearly again. It looks like rest. Routine. Friends who do not require emotional acrobatics. A home that feels calm. A life that is no longer constantly interrupted by one person's storms. But this is the truth many people miss. Healing is often built through ordinary acts of devotion to yourself. Not one giant dramatic moment. Not one perfect epiphany. 100 smaller acts of return. Claire returns to herself every time she honors what she knows. Every time she notices the familiar pull of the old dynamic and does not step all the way back into it. Every time she chooses a truthful limit over a performative peace. Every time she refuses to treat another person's chaos as the organizing principle of her day. Every time she gives her body something gentler than adrenaline. Every time she believes her own exhaustion instead of arguing with it. Every time she stops trying to prove that she is good by tolerating what is harmful. This is what rebuilding a life looks like. And that rebuilding matters because narcissistic dynamics often leave behind more than pain. They leave behind identity confusion. You forget what you like. You forget what calm feels like. You forget how much energy you once had for your own ideas, your own pleasures, your own voice. You forget that relationships can feel mutual. You forget that your nervous system was not designed to live in constant rehearsal. So part of recovery is not just ending arguments. It is remembering yourself. Remembering what you love without needing permission. Remembering what makes your body unclench. Remembering what kind of conversation leaves you feeling more alive instead of smaller. Remembering what safety feels like when nobody is asking you to earn it. Remembering that your worth does not become more real when a difficult person finally approves of you. For many people, this is where grief and freedom begin to mingle. Because yes, there is grief in this stage. Grief that the person may never become who you hoped. Grief that some of your deepest efforts were poured into a place that could not return them. Grief that years were spent circling pain instead of building peace. Grief that the story did not end the way your generous heart wanted it to. But grief is not the opposite of freedom. Sometimes grief is the doorway into it. Because once you stop spending all your energy trying to rescue the relationship from its own truth, you finally have enough energy to rescue yourself from living inside that truth forever. And this is where values matter. If Claire is going to build a different life, it cannot be built only on anger. Anger may wake her up, but it cannot sustain her future. The life after narcissistic entanglement has to be built on something steadier. Dignity. Honesty. Compassion with discernment. Loyalty to what is real. Protection of the nervous system. Emotional sobriety. Love that does not require self-betrayal. Boundaries that are not punishments but forms of stewardship. That is what keeps healing from turning into bitterness. Because the goal is not to become obsessed with what damaged you. The goal is to become devoted to what restores you. That difference changes the whole emotional atmosphere of recovery. It means Claire no longer wakes each day asking, "How do I handle them?" Instead, she begins asking, "What kind of life am I building now? What kind of energy do I want in my home? What kind of love do I want to model? What do I want my children, if I have them, to learn by watching me? What kind of friendships feel nourishing? What kind of conversations feel honest? What kind of work feels meaningful? What kind of rest feels earned? What kind of peace feels like mine?" Those are life-giving questions. They pull a person out of reaction and into authorship. And authorship is one of the deepest forms of power a person can reclaim after years of emotional distortion. To become the author of your days again. To stop writing every chapter in response to someone else's instability. To stop measuring success by how little conflict you create for difficult people. To stop shaping your life around minimizing their eruptions and start shaping it around maximizing your integrity, your steadiness, your joy. That is not selfish. That is adulthood reclaimed. And if there is one final truth to leave here, it is this: You do not have to become less loving in order to become less available for harm. That fear keeps many people stuck. They worry that if they stop engaging, stop explaining, stop overgiving, stop making room for every distortion and demand, they will become mean. But refusing to abandon yourself is not cruelty. Protecting your mind is not cruelty. Refusing manipulation is not cruelty. Choosing a life that is not built around somebody else's need for control is not cruelty. It is wisdom with a pulse. Claire may still care about the person in Charleston in whatever complicated way history allows. She may still understand that damaged people often damage others. She may still feel moments of sadness, tenderness, disappointment, even longing. Healing does not erase complexity. But complexity no longer has the right to run her life. That is the victory. Not a perfect ending. Not a dramatic revenge. Not a final scene where the narcissist suddenly sees everything and falls to pieces in regret. The victory is quieter and far more powerful than that. It is Claire walking into the next chapter of her life less afraid of losing herself. It is her learning that peace does not come from winning the argument but from no longer living inside it. It is her discovering that power is not control over another person, but stewardship over her own mind, body, choices, and future. It is her remembering that her life was never meant to be a permanent response to somebody else's emptiness. And once a person remembers that, something extraordinary happens. The story stops being about the narcissist. At last, it becomes about the person who survived them and chose to live. Claire's story is not just about one difficult person in Charleston. It is about what happens when a human being spends too long standing near someone who must always be the center of the emotional universe. At first, she does what many thoughtful, loving, self-aware people do. She tries to understand. She tries to stay fair. She tries to communicate better, soften her tone, choose the right timing, and hope that truth, kindness, and patience will eventually create safety. But over time, she begins to see that the real damage is not always loud. It is subtle. It is cumulative. It is the slow erosion of her peace, her confidence, her clarity, and her right to exist in a relationship without constantly managing someone else's ego, moods, reactions, and need for control. What makes Claire's journey so powerful is that she does not wake up one day with instant certainty. Her transformation is gradual, painful, and deeply human. She learns that narcissism is not just confidence or a big ego. It is a relational pattern that leaves other people feeling erased. She learns that arguing does not bring resolution when the other person is not seeking truth, but control. She learns that hoping harder does not heal a dynamic that feeds on confusion. She learns that boundaries are not always speeches, sometimes they are quiet acts of self-respect. She learns that the hardest family situations do not come with simple answers, especially when love, guilt, marriage, parenting, money, and history are all tied together. She learns that fear can make people rush to labels too quickly, whether they are looking at a teenager or at an ex moving on to someone new. And finally, she learns the deepest lesson of all: peace begins when your life stops revolving around the question of them. The profound lesson in Claire's story is this: you cannot build a healthy life by making someone else's dysfunction the center of your emotional world. You may never get the apology. You may never get the confession, the clarity, or the justice you hoped for. But you can still reclaim your life. You can still trust patterns over promises. You can still choose reality over illusion. You can still protect your nervous system, your time, your children, your values, and your future. Real strength is not winning every argument. Real strength is refusing to lose yourself inside one. So how do you apply this to your life right now? Start by becoming honest about the patterns around you. Notice who leaves you feeling small, confused, guilty, or drained. Stop over-explaining where simple truth is enough. Build internal boundaries that do not depend on anyone else's approval. Prepare for difficult people instead of hoping they will suddenly become easy. Put your energy into support systems, healthy relationships, therapy, rest, meaningful work, and the parts of yourself that were neglected while you were busy surviving someone else's chaos. Most importantly, stop asking, "How do I finally make them understand me?" and begin asking, "What protects my peace, my dignity, and my life?" Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only. It is meant to share insight and understanding, not to replace professional diagnosis, therapy, or mental health treatment from a licensed psychologist, psychiatrist, or therapist. Here's a quick question for you. When dealing with a narcissistic person, what do you think matters more in the end? A. Getting them to finally understand the pain they caused. B. Protecting your peace even if they never understand. Comment A or B below. And I'd really love to hear your perspective too. What part of this story hit you the hardest, and what lesson do you think people most need to hear today? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience too. And if this message resonated with you, subscribe to the channel to support the work and help keep these meaningful conversations going.